Hello everyone, today we talk about Eastern Eurasian steppes warfare. Incidentally, as you know that I pick my topics randomly, from last year this steppes warfare has had important incidents, and even tomorrow I think we will talk about again steppes warfare, etc. I don't really do it on purpose, but the more I talk about it and the more I realize how much it's neglected in a way and overlooked, of course, for understanding much also of the broader Eurasian warfare in general. So this video is part of a series that I started, I think, last autumn, that is a minimal introduction to the warfare of certain specific regions. This one is very wide and therefore also flattened, not just in interest of space because these territories are huge, but also of time, because technically this would be about the warfare between the mid-11th, mid-14th century, but unavoidably also, given the scarcity of sources, unfortunately for this Central Asian context, we have to extend to a bit before, at least, to understand what they were coming from. And they're just a broader introduction to the warfare in general. And as you understand at that point, you have, and that's where we will descend up into tactics in a way, but as always, the more you approximate, the more it gets strategic, the more it gets political in nature. So it's important even just to look at a map to understand what we're talking about. So we're essentially looking at this stripe of land, quite extended one, that stretches from west to east to, let's say, this relatively narrow corridor between the southern Ural Mountains and the Caspian Sea, to essentially the Far East, up to Manchuria fundamentally, up to Mongolia broadly meant. Now, most of the peoples of the region at this point were essentially Turkic in origin, right? In early medieval times, essentially as I explained many times, what occurred historically is that the western steppes were kind of more civilized, the ones that had come more openly in contact with more civilized populations, and albeit the eastern ones, of course, were close to China as well, there was a broader Central Asian reality that also, even if you look at territory, was somewhat, first of all, huge, and in part, given the natural obstacles, also more detached properly from a direct contact with certain populations. So that as we will see, like in the case of the Qara-Khitay, I mean, all of them were. We made a video about the Liao Empire recently, and we have observed, and we'll talk about the Qara-Khitay again today, in fact, at least mostly in the western part. And we observed in that video how heavily influenced also they were by Chinese warfare. They had an important presence of infantry, for example, of technology as well, as they also had to cope against cities and so on. Siege warfare. Most of Central Asian warfare was definitely nomadic, semi-nomadic, whatever you want to call it, almost universally based at the core on the usual formula of the ultra elite, both qualitatively and numerically, of heavy cavalry and then these swarms of horse archers. But it's not so simple either, because of course at this point, especially in the High Middle Ages, there was, even among these populations, a process of modernization, of secularization, even though it may sound anachronistic, but that's how it was going. And the broader direction that this took had been essentially from the northeast, right? It had started, if you look at a European perspective, with the Indo-Europeans, so that also part of the Iranians had remained up to the early Middle Ages as the prevalent military culture out there that still pushed, with these waves, also pushed by other peoples, however, coming east. And the other big wave in the 6th, 7th centuries, etc., had been one of the Turks. And later on, the Mongols will be essentially the last ones. So it was these, the more primitive, the more warlike in a way, and capable of making this push, and eventually, however, settling down and, exhausting that push historically. So today we don't talk about that, because we made several videos now about also medieval Mongolia, and also, in fact, the same steppes warfare, where we more or less say in part the same things because of the similarities indeed among these peoples. There were among the aside from the Turks we talk about, because today we don't talk about Mongol warfare properly. We'll talk about another occasion, but still, of course, among these peoples, mostly Turkic in origins, there were Mongols, and and related tribes, properly, especially around the Amur Basin, and near the Pamir and Tian Shan mountains, especially various Iranian tribes intermingled with the Turks. These were areas that had been populated by the Indo-Europeans from millennia, and eventually they blended in with the Turks that also maintained a big deal of their military traditions, also the equestrian zootechnic capacity. Just the other day we were making a video about Sogdiana, Bactria, and and Central Asia in general, and the Fergana Valley, especially in their equestrian horse breeding traditions. That was arguably the best in the world as far as military employment was concerned. These things lived on, and these cultures were relatively boundless, right, within each other. Now, north of this, the steppe is just like a corridor stretching in longitude, whereas in the north lay the Siberian forests, which were partly inhabited by the Turkic or Ural-Altaic Mongol tribes that were somewhat more primitive in nature, as we will see now. While in the south there were, the civilizations of China. Then you had, of course, Tibet, Islamic Transoxiana, then Eastern Iran, and then the Middle East properly opening later. And as we will see, the contacts between the steppes in these areas were particularly intense, much more than the ones that the same ones we had in Europe, as a matter of fact, right? We were relatively marginal geographically to this process, but still being invested heavily, as we know from especially our series about medieval knighthood and all, and about knighthood in general, and how this all came from this ancestral steppe homeland, right? And that spread really far and wide. But it's important to understand how, at which point, even politically, this connection existed between Central Asia and the surrounding cultures. Speaking of the Eastern Eurasian steppes, we can say, of course, that there was a great cultural diversity, because there were many different peoples that were surely different for degree of, for example, of sedentarization, of simply of the climates they lived in, the size of their powers, the peoples they interacted with. But especially when it came to warfare and their arms and armor, let's say these peoples do display a striking similarity, if not homogeneity, by a certain degree at least. As we were saying before, horse archery was the dominant form of combat. The composite bow was by far the most important weapon. Some argue that in these cultures the bow was even more important, at least archetypically, symbologically, than the sword. This can be debated in a way. But surely it was something much more, present and even complex compared, of course, to our simple bow that we had in the West. There are, speaking of the influences with other cultures that were reciprocal. If you look at the medieval Central Asian Turkic composite bow, for example, in a typical fashion, well, this was surely related with the Sasanian and Chinese types. Right, and that had been just a mutual exchange, and in these countries, composite bows, in fact, were the normality. Now, this type of bow, however, had been, cavalry. We made a video about the origins of cavalry proper. That was something relatively recent, right? Properly the invention of the horse, quite literally, and chariot warfare, etc. It's something that matures just by the time of the Iron Age, right? Having properly just cavalry, horse riders in masses, with a satisfactory degree of collective training for charges and so on. So much of these areas had pioneered actually that kind of equestrian warfare, and had thus adopted the bow that naturally was older than cavalry. And in this fashion, there had been actually mutual changes, because of course the bow was adapted also for chariot warfare, etc., and consequently also the infantry one. But for the horsemen that had arrived later in that fashion, of course, the adaptation of the bow had mostly brought the gradual reduction in size, right? Make it more suitable properly from a mounted use, right? Which required essentially less space for the draw, but also and consequently for maintaining at least the same performance, having a greater physical strength to pull it. And of course, these horsemen were capable of amazing, stunts, and having adopted basically everything of their very strict lifestyle that was essentially a military one to this kind of combat. So typical was, the bent knees, also later on with higher stirrup, and in fact a smaller bow. So the idea also was being crouched on horseback most of the time, not to be exposed more greatly to in surface to arrow fire, which was the standard there. And some of the northernmost tribes clung to a primitive version of this still archery-dominated civilization, right? We find, for example, arrowheads and spearheads made of bone. We have seen this. Siberia has been studied anthropologically, quite interestingly. A lot of missions, etc. There are still peoples out there at the beginning of the last century who could display this magnificent lamellar cuirasses, sometimes, in fact, in bone, right? And there was a striking homogeneity. Like if you look at the typical lamellar armor you can find among the Avars or this, the Eastern Germanic peoples. Think about the Longobards, etc., which weren't technically even Eastern, but that to see how much this culture was impacting. They say that from the Pannonian Plain to Manchuria, like you would have basically the same type of design, which even if it was functional to that type of warfare, that was importantly designed also for stopping arrow fire, that, as we will see, was actually very developed, right? Arrow fire here was, if you look at arrow tips types in this context, were very specialized, right? They had some of the, of course, we're talking about such a huge amount of time, space, and people that it's difficult to generalize, but let's say that comparatively to the West, for example, on average, there was a greater specialization of arrow types, and including even tricks. I think about the hissing sound, a psychological effect enhanced, or even little caves within under the tip to host poison, right? And all this nice these amenities, and especially these peoples had interesting ways to kind of go past armor and shields, right? Not quite, of course, as long as armor and shields existed, they were effective to a large degree to this, but the effort for higher penetration especially was evidently there and more specialized than in other cultures, arguably, at least on a regular basis. When we look instead at other peoples that were, however, more exposed to that were more exposed to advanced civilizations, like for example the Chinese one, we look among the others, for example, the Qara-Khitay, that had adopted much also of that aspect of sedentary warfare, as we will see now. The Qara-Khitay had essentially controlled for many years a substantial empire between Transoxiana and the western end of the Great Wall of China. And they had a very advanced military organization that we have in part seen in the Liao Empire's one comparatively. It was described in a 13th century Islamic military treatise as the battle layout of the Turks when the Khakan is present. That is to say, when they make the big war, right? And we will talk about in detail about these tactics, but on another occasion, but we can already say from here, and on the basis of what we have already seen, that albeit dominated by cavalry, these armies also included a remarkable infantry force that had, in fact, in parallel, that same importance in tactical roles, and even some features of Chinese warfare, like, in fact, crossbows, halberds, and even explosives, etc. And there was a great deal of hybridization between these powers, a certain degree. So the outlook was always kind of nomadic in aspect and appearance, but still there was an infantry role that probably had to do with the fact that cavalry among these peoples tended to engage very often on, let's say, in greater numbers, especially the closer it got to China, probably hand-to-hand combat on a larger scale, whereas most of these peoples tended to avoid hand-to-hand combat and mostly kept each other aside, with missile fire, and then eventually somebody would retreat, and or of course there could be a resolution with heavier cavalry, but it was sometimes not even needed. These other peoples, being more developed ahead, were kind of also heavier in some nature, were better protected. We have seen that in the Liao Empire, for example, at least the list of equipment needed was something astonishing. You would even question how they could bring all that stuff on horseback in the first place, and being a functional mounted force. In any case, the infantry probably followed the cavalry to fall on the enemy's rear while they were engaged in, and of course this entailed that the infantry had to, before surrounding the enemy cavalry, in that sense, cope with other infantry from the other side. This is kind of interesting, at least as long as symmetry is concerned among these peoples, who of course always fought against each other, but were also exposed, in fact, as we've just seen here, to something more nomadic, more primitive, but not necessarily less effective in nature. Now, there is in fact a big deal of Chinese influence there from a very early age in Central Asia that we were documented, in fact, in that other video we were saying before about Sogdiana, Fergana, and Bactria. Because the Chinese went fighting there, right, even passed properly from the, up to the western side of the steppes. And the Qara-Khitay, and this is typical of the semi-nomadic empires, included other peoples, because they were properly their subjects, or at least they were recognized, some suzerainty on them. One of these were the Kardluks, right, that were largely pastoral, like these semi-nomadic populations, but in part they were also urbanized and Islamicized. They were still tribes, but this allowed them a higher standard of material culture, which is even truer. It was even greater, for example, than the Oghuz one further west, from which the same Seljuks stemmed, and in part, kind of very influenced by that same Central Asian warfare. This is interesting because, as we will see, even Seljuk warfare is, we tend to stress the Persification of the Turks, in that sense, saying that the Seljuks were kind of like Persians at the end of the day, even though they were Turks. Well, yes and no. I mean, the great part of their military culture still reflects a markedly Central Asian element, right? That of course was blended with Persian military culture and so on, but the same Persian military culture in many ways had been influenced by the Central Asian one over the millennia. So it's interesting to assess, however, the Seljuks taking over the Middle East and up to even the Near East were still basically more similar to a Central Asian military culture than a Middle Eastern one, which cannot be said from, I don't know, the Egyptians, for example, fought in a completely different way. It was much more Western in nature, right? And during the Crusades, that is evident. The Turks had very different armies from the Egyptians, even though they shared a lot as well there already. Now, there were also the highly civilized Uighurs, that we all remember because of what is going on in China, sadly enough, inhabiting the Tarim Basin, who also were included within the Qara-Khitay sphere. Now, the Uighurs were largely Buddhist at the time. There was a broader influence of the religion, as you know, also far north and west. They had many towns. They were very advanced in handcraft. They had very exquisite art. They were skilled metal workers. However, and this is fascinating, these Central Asian cultures, they still coupled that with an excellent horsemanship and archery, right? So that this is fascinating because it shows that even though the steppes were not completely nomadic at all, there was even properly urbanization there. In some places, of course, was not the normality, but this still required an important fitness to steppe warfare, which is necessary to cope with, especially with these powerful confederacies that formed and that were always warring and kept up, the military quality. And if you wanted to survive in there, you had to have that core capacity. And of course, it was just a reason, of course, of how the community had come to form in the steppe in general, so the environmental aspect, but of course the political one is the most important. The Uyghurs represented also an important channel through which the Central Asian military cultures reached China and vice versa. And there is an evidence of a reciprocal exchange. For example, lamellar armor in what is being identified as properly Turkic style was evidently received in China by a certain degree. China took a lot from terms of metallurgy, etc., from these peoples of the steppes. This is normal, right? When it's important not to make moral relativism when talking about history, or technology, and science, etc. You can have peoples that are kind of less developed, but still, make it better on some other field, or especially the warlike ones are, the ones that will surely produce better arms and armor, or metallurgy and so on. Think about even in Europe, right? Central Europe compared to the Mediterranean, they still were very warlike. They received, by the way, from the steppes themselves, some capacities that they refined further for the more advanced southern civilizations eventually to adopt, but it's still remaining fundamentally what they were. So this is, however, quite interesting because that China had quite a versatile and dramatically developed army. And so from everything, the Chinese literally invaded the Sogdiana a couple of times just for Ghana to take their horses, right? Because they needed them for their own cavalry. There was all a doctrinal aim there that is evident for such a structured military. There are also certain styles of archery in China that have been traced to kind of an Islamic Mamluk, even rather than Central Asian influence, which means that the Turkic developments that were taking place properly from the other side of the Tarim Basin were pouring also in China, which is quite interesting because we know, as a matter of fact, that even the advanced Chinese artillery very often was manned by Islamic engineers, which is very, that also tells you a lot about the history of technology and how certain things work. Of course, knowledge, know-how properly, and techniques were, we tend to maybe overly emphasize them as kind of indicators. Of course, they were more spread than they seemed, also because it's difficult properly to track them and to track an idea, right? And these people's, what is important for us to rather, that was more beneficial for us to understand these things, is that these peoples were always in continuous contact, right? So there's nothing to be surprised of. Even some forms of leather shields might have come from the West, in China, etc. So we're talking obviously about mostly the Arabo-Islamic West and Turkic peoples rather. But But on this, I also believe that this is what Nicole, for example, believes. But you know, he was quite interested in the nuisances of these resemblances, and therefore stressing the dependency, the connection, the teaching in some way. I believe that is more likely that, you know, especially when you talk about things like shields, it's not that there are so many ways you can make a shield, frankly, and changes occur for reasons that kind of everybody can arrive to. Single weapons and arms and armors, let's say, can develop in multiple places at the same time. And maybe, yeah, it has no sense even to distinguish that from the connection, because the world was already globalized at the time. So we constantly underestimate human mobility, and also the one of ideas especially. There were also other Turkic peoples dwelling outside of the Qara-Khitay sphere. It was the most powerful confederacy, as we have seen. One of these were the Khalijas, right? They had migrated south across the Oxus River into what is today's Afghanistan by the mid-11th century, and they had served Mahmud of Ghazna, so the Ghaznavid Empire that stretched from Afghanistan even into India and Punjab, as mercenaries, right? And they would eventually found the second Islamic dynasty in same India, ruling from 1290 to 1320. Right, so it's always this idea in a way that the primitive barbarian warlike mercenary that manages to take over and invade the most, soften up civilization, fertile, sedentary civilization, and then remaining absorbed by them at a certain point, especially in India. The Khalis, however, stretched further east. In fact, some of them might have even properly adopted Bengali or Bhutanese military hardware in the mid-13th century. We're talking about, for example, bamboo helmets, shields, lamellar armor, right? Literally made all of bamboo, allegedly, which of course is not the case, but still, you know, it's important as an influence, and surely that made its effect as well. But for example, they retained their Turkic bow. That was they were traditionally skilled in. Another important people that maintained a distinct identity and even some very interesting military features. They're a bit the best documented for some reason, or at least for how we came to research on them later on, are the Kyrgyz, right? And the reason being that their grave sites have produced such a wide range of let's say provided us such a wide range of military equipment as an evidence. In these cultures, you would think that armor was somewhat rare, but that's never quite the case. In some Kyrgyz graves, we find axes that are not terribly frequent as a weapon in Eastern Eurasia, but these are quite interesting because you have the cutting, you have the cut that is quite narrow, right? And so, you know, good for chopping properly flesh and other thing, organic material. Then you have in the back kind of a hammer tip that is evidently, you know, functional to armor, for trauma in armor. And whenever you find this stuff, you know there was armor around in a significant manner. Very important in the history of Islam, the Middle East, and of course were the Oghuz Turks. We made a video about their army organization exactly last year, and there was a pre-Islamic Western Turkic Empire already that, however, had come to disintegrate after the wave of conquest, even before Islam spread in Transoxiana and Turkestan, talking about the 8th century. So the Oghuz eventually emerged as the main Turkic power, immediately north of the Islamic Eastern Iran, so also the most Central Asian influenced military-wise and Transoxiana. They also controlled the steppes east of the Karluk territory, interestingly enough. The Seljuks essentially emerged from the Oghuz in a very conflictual way with the same, especially the latter phase. They put a nail in their coffin, basically. And they adopted Islam and began to initially actually to roam the steppes, right, as they had been exiled by the same Oghuz confederacy, and they thus, figured as allies or tributaries or existing dynasties at in those places, and serving as mercenaries, in fact, already in that environment from which they would have eventually taken over. So that would occur in the early 11th century, where they created properly their own state within the northeastern corner of the Islamic world. So again, the one mostly influenced by Central Asian warfare. And as we know, by the mid-century, they occupied all Iran, Mesopotamia, and they would expand even up to Syria, and crushing the Byzantine army at Manzikert in 1071, spread and took over basically all continental Anatolia, and later on it would also kind of feudalize in a way. They were individually the same dynasty, but not ever being properly a unitary power altogether, or at least recognizing some sultanial suzerainty, but with great difficulties. That's another story, but it's the story of a people that reinjected dramatically the Central Asian military culture, maybe that injected the most Central Asian military culture in the Middle East before the Mongol conquest. And this is very important. It can be observed by many details. That influence specifically had already been witnessed, and sometimes from very early times, because also all these gulams, right, Turkic slaves, eventually I talk of the Mamluks properly, that had been, had immediately been hired by the Caliphate as soon as it been established. I mean, you find certain Central Asian quiver styles in 8th century, 7th century Syria. So very early on. You can argue they were, roaming around at the same time in those areas as, the Magyars were settling in the Pannonian, but even before, when the Avars had already pushed through, the western steppes up to the Carpathians. So even later on, for example, there is the specific style of quivers. These quivers they used were quite large, right? Especially the ones that they kept always with them as they lived on horseback properly. But there were other types, for example, lighter quivers that were designed to speed up the process of extraction of the arrow, that were typical of mercenaries, properly professional for warriors that were hired in these places. There are many details you can look at, even properly the nature of armor. Armor could be very complex in this area. Very often it's been said, especially the early Turks had very light armor. It's been, leather has been put out very often, saying, it was probably, there's all a debate about this, but definitely we see in the Eastern Eurasian steppe a quite composite armor, right, from properly the lamella. Sometimes it's all we can get, but we understand that some of them were not just for the torso, they were for various parts of the body, and that they could be definitely quite complex, put together in a quite elaborate armor. All things that one should see in detail. If there weren't, I don't know what the studies have arrived relatively. Probably they have advanced quite from at least from the texts that I'm reading. But let's say, properly, we have difficulties of sometimes even of dating certain sources. For example, the balbals, right? There was this kind of there were carved standing stones in the steppes that are notoriously difficult to date, because you can't quite say that. Sometimes they were, yes, that you can date them on the basis of their art that evolves. It's from something more primitive, something much more anthropomorphic over time. But we're talking about sometimes, I don't know, half a millennium of history. It's not clear, and there are also relatively small, because the after all the local, dress was quite simple. Most of the horsemen were largely unarmored, so you can't even derive such great amount of information. The Kyrgyz graves are definitely very interesting, as we were talking about before, and surely you can appreciate, especially the archery development that we maintain as quite complex, even properly for the sake of anti-armor use. I don't know what we could add. There is some, there is even some degree of uniformity of lamellar cuirass in the broader Central Asian area. For example, there is sometimes a small domed boss in the center of each element that is worth noticing, because it appears in several lamellar and scale armor from Russia to Mongolia, right? And that's how far it came to influence even West. We see also some transition, for example, from laced lamella, or to rivet scales that could be used at the same point. There is also mail out there, of course, so we can't be, categorical about what was the standard, appearance really of a specific armor. But generally speaking, lamellar was the at least the most common thing we see out there. And and there are some analogies also with other manufacturers. For example, there is a Kyrgyz helmet dated to the 12th, 13th century that has been squashed flat, but it is of directly riveted form. You have the segments fastened to one another, which is very similar, basically identical to other helmets in Central Asia and Eastern Europe of the previous centuries, if it wasn't for the addition of a strengthening band around its base. Right, this may have to do with the hammering of armor in a more feudal sense that might have properly encompass the steppe as well. That another important change towards the early Middle Ages was the passage from the straight sword to saber, at least in some at a mass level. There have been questions of why this happened, and it's, apologically speaking, may not make sense even as a question, because still different traditions remain. But the idea is that the saber actually requires less training of the straight sword than the straight sword, and it might have had to do with the injection of the masses of horsemen, probably from Central Asia to the most, actually in the Western Eurasian steppe, with the arrival of the Turks and the Ural-Altaic Mongol peoples eventually later on. And because the masses of the horsemen were kind of less, necessarily less trained, whereas the Indo-Europeans were kind of more knightly in nature. This may be an important change that we see from the central stuff. But it's really remarkable to connect, especially I would say the Seljuk invasion with an important reinjection also of Central Asian features that we can observe, in fact, way before the Mongol conquest in the Middle East, and it's somewhat overlooked. However, we will keep talking in detail about all these various peoples. Probably also tomorrow we'll talk not well, we'll talk about the Central Asians, let's say better. Again, heavy cavalrymen, so we'll see what I managed to put together as also on the basis of what I was reflecting on today. For now, however, we stop it here. Just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.